All right, good morning, everyone. Hope everybody's doing well and enjoying their conference here. So it was a great presentation by Steve Shurtleff about ecological weed management. And that's always a challenge with reducing tillage, so good segue into this session. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Matt Ryan. I am an associate professor at Cornell University, and so I've been working with Dr. Silva for a number of years on organic no-till. And today we have two people, Ben Brockmueller and Chris Pelzer, who are going to be sharing some research updates about some of the work that we've been doing together over the past several years. So really excited to hear about what they have to say. And I would say that this research that we're doing, I feel like this is really important. We're really trying to push the envelope with organic no-till. And instead of hearing from us, from the researchers, the professors, this is an opportunity to hear from the people who are actually out in the field doing the work, making the equipment adjustments, and really driving the tractors and getting the work done. So really excited to hear from these folks. I also wanted to mention that if you like what you're hearing today in this session, our research that we do is funded through the USDA. And we are in the process right now of putting together another grant proposal. A lot of this work is based on this proposal that we put in 4 years ago, I think, the organic reduced tillage or organic no-till proposal. This was taking out tillage in organic production. And so right now we're in this phase of this, this kind of time period where we're putting our ideas together for our next proposal. And what's really important for getting funding for this type of research is documenting stakeholder support for the research. So what we have here for you to consider signing is a sign-on letter where you can list your name and your affiliation and your location. And so if you would like to see more of this type of work being done, if you have ideas for us, we're very happy to hear those ideas, and we want to work with you to try to advance some organic no-till research in the future. So please do consider signing the letter that is going to be passed around. And again, this is really important for helping us document that this is interesting to you all and that we are doing something useful. So really important for our research and getting funding. But please do consider, no pressure if you're not into this or you don't want to sign. By no means do you have to. This is just something that I think is helpful for us. But it's really up to you. So I am not going to take up any more time. I think the first speaker is going to be Ben Brockmueller from Dr. Aaron Silva's lab. So right here in Madison, Wisconsin, doing a lot of really good research on organic no-till production.
Thanks, Matt, and good morning, everybody. It's great to see you all here. And over the course of this conference, Chris and I have had the chance to talk with many of you about organic no-till and see the interest in it, and also to discuss with you some of the things that you're doing on your farm. So really excited to get a chance to share some of what we're seeing at our research farm here in Arlington, Wisconsin. And also really excited to have Chris Pelzer, my colleague from Cornell University, come all the way out here to Wisconsin, join us, and share what they're seeing up at their farms in Cornell. So today we're going to be starting off by discussing this cover crop-based organic no-till system. And so what this is it's a rotational no-till system where we're growing a cereal rye cover crop and roller crimping that early in the summer, and then having that rye mulch act as a weed suppressive tool throughout the growing season. And so when we look at the timeline a little bit, really what we want to do is we want to manage this cover crop like it's our crop. We want to invest a lot in it because this is going to be our weed control strategy throughout the growing season. And so this means typically planting pretty early, somewhere in early September to mid-September at the latest. And we plant relatively high seeding rates, going around 170 or so pounds per acre. And then once we get that crop established, it grows throughout the late fall, over winters, and then puts on goes through kind of an exponential growth curve as we get into May, and really adds a lot of biomass very quickly. And then once we get to that stage of anthesis, where we can start to see the anthers on this plant, that's when we can go out, have that sign to start roller crimping it and planting our soybeans. And what we really like about this is it's a pretty, once we get to the summer, it's a pretty hands-off approach. We don't have to go out there, do our cultivations, and so it's really a labor-saving kind of tool. And we can just let that rye mulch do its work throughout the summer up until we get to harvest. So when things work really well, this is what it looks like. We can see our soybeans coming up through the mulch layer. In July, we see that mulch layer that's suppressing the weeds, and in August, we see that canopy of soybeans start to close over. But we're more interested, Chris and I, today in talking about when things don't work really well, and so we want to talk about adaptive management. That's been kind of a big theme of this conference for us. And so I really credit Matt Ryan and his crew here at Cornell University for putting together this flow chart to really help us think about how we can manage winter rye in these no-till systems, and especially adaptively manage winter rye. So we can see these different inflection points throughout the growing season that give us time to pause and make a decision on how we want to proceed with this. So this first one is before we even plant the rye. We want to ask, are we going into a field that's relatively weed-free, and especially of perennial weeds? And I just have some pictures up here of what happens when we don't have that kind of situation. And so, for example, we can see Canada thistle really starting to proliferate in this one field. Quackgrass has been another big issue for us. And so perennial weeds have really been an issue for us in this kind of system if we don't manage it well. And what this rye mulch does a really, really good job of is suppressing our annual broadleaf weeds. So we don't see a lot of pigweed or velvet leaf or lamb's quarter in these kind of systems, but plants like Canada thistle or quackgrass really don't mind this rye mulch layer too much and do pretty well at coming through that. And so if we don't manage our systems in other parts of the rotations well, we can really start to see a change in the weed community towards more of these perennial weeds. The second question point we want to ask is in the early spring. We want to go out there after the snow frost has started to come off and take a look at what our soil coverage is. And what's really important for this is our planting date. So if we were able to get in early, you can see some pretty ideal soil coverage here. This is a September 17th planting date on the far side. But when we plant late, we don't get that biomass production in the fall, and we don't get that soil coverage then early in the spring. And this is not a good situation for going into a no-till kind of situation. So not sure if Chris Wilson is in this room, but I've heard him talk about how we're looking really for about 80% soil coverage. And if we can get that amount of soil coverage, we're in a pretty good situation to go into a no-till kind of situation. But if we get less than 50, it gets really, really dicey. And so this can be easy to measure just with a Canopeo app. You go out, you take a picture, much like these pictures I have here, and it gives you in real time what your soil coverage is. So it's just a good tool for assessing where you're at in the early spring and then making a decision going forward about how you want to manage that. And then the final decision point here is right before planting, and this is related to weather now. And what we experienced here in the Midwest and across a lot of the eastern part of the United States as well, going into Pennsylvania and New York, was really, really dry conditions this summer. And this map here is coming from June 5th, which is right about that time when our rye is reaching anthesis and when we're thinking about going in and roller crimping and planting. And so we could see a pretty substantial soil moisture deficit here, which really gives us pause on how we want to manage this system. And so here at our Wisconsin station, this is just kind of a graph of what our precipitation looked like over the year. And from May 15th to June 15th, which is that time of year when that rye is really adding a lot of biomass and we're going into planting, we only had less than a quarter or 3/4 of an inch of rainfall during that 1 month. And this is a time of year when we're typically seeing around 4 inches of annual rainfall. And so some issues that we saw from that, this is some soybeans that we had. Took this picture on June 22nd. This is 1 month after we planted them, and those seeds are still sitting in the furrow in dry soil. Another issue we had was just really uneven emergence this year. So all of this was planted on the same day, but the beans in the background caught a little bit of soil moisture where they were. The ones in the foreground didn't. And so figuring out how to do cultivation and weed management on beans where some of it's at V2 and some of it's just emerging was kind of an adventure this year, as I'm sure many of you experienced on your farms as well. So talking about yields for a second. So this is some data we have from the University of Wisconsin, the last 9 years or so that we've done these systems where we've compared no-till versus our tilled systems. And what really jumps out at you as you start to look at this, so we have yield on the one side and then the amount of precipitation we had during the months of May and June on the other side. And when we have sufficient precipitation during that spring period, we can see our no-till systems perform pretty well. Typically typically within 5 bushels per acre of our tilled systems. But these boxes that I have highlighted here, these are spring conditions where we had less than 8 inches of rainfall in the months of May and June, and that's where we really start to see these yield gaps start to form between our no-till and our tilled systems. And another way of looking at this is we put together some graphs. So this is basically a proportion of our no-till soybean yields versus our tilled soybean yields. So a value of 1 on this graph is indicating that our no-till performed equivalently to our tilled systems, whereas a value of 0.6 is saying that we had essentially 60% of the yield in our no-till systems. Or another way of saying that is that we had a 40% yield reduction in our no-till systems. And when we compare that to our precipitation that we saw in the early spring in May and June, we see a really strong correlation between those. So this R-squared value of 0.73 is essentially saying that 73% of the differences in yield by year were explained by this one variable here, this precipitation we saw from May 15th to June 15th. So it's really, really strong predictor of how our soybean yields are going to look is the amount of precipitation we're seeing in the early spring. So that leads to the question, well, what do we do when we're going into drought kind of conditions? And we have a few different options, and we've here at the University of Wisconsin, we've experienced different ways that we might think about this over the years. So one option is just to terminate the cover crop. And for us, 2022 would have been a good example where this might have been a good option for us. We had a really, really dry year before that. We were somewhere around 10 inches or so below normal in our annual precipitation. And going into the month of May, we were still dry, weren't really seeing a lot in the forecast for rains. So that might be an option where we would just want to terminate the cover crop. But to do this, you got to do it early, because once that rye really gets past the jointing stage, it starts to really exponentially add growth. And it can be hard to incorporate all of that material and get that field turned around in a couple weeks' time to plant soybeans. Another option is to just let the crop go for harvest of grains. And so, for example, this year would have been a good year for us to take that option. The rains really shut off around the middle of May for us, and at that point that rye had already put a lot of growth on, but we could tell based on the forecasts and the soil moisture conditions that going into a no-till kind of situation was going to be difficult for us. So this might be a situation where we would want to consider just letting that crop go for grain harvest. And then the third option that we've been looking at more and more, and especially if you were here for the Thursday night conversation with Klaus Martens, is forage harvesting this cover crop and getting some additional value from that. And then the question that we're really asking is, can we still go and do no-till soybeans into that system after we forage harvest it? So I'm going to turn this over to Chris now, and he's going to talk about an experiment that we did across both universities here.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so in terms of this adaptive management, one of the strategies that we discussed and we designed to experiment with New York and Wisconsin was to look at triticale before soybean. And so there's some work from Jeff Liebert at Cornell where it seemed like there was some promise in terms of triticale as a cover crop before soybean, good weed suppression. But then one of the other values is using it as a double crop. So harvesting that triticale, a little bit easier forage harvest windows, and then also a little bit higher forage quality. And so what we wanted to do was harvest the forage and then basically no-till plant into that triticale stubble. But then we're still curious about other options, different ways of managing the triticale. So we also no-till planted into the triticale and then rolled. One thing that's a little bit different about this system is we're actually planting, no-till planting into the triticale, and then we're actually rolling after soybean emergence, just to get the timing right. Triticale typically, it reaches anthesis, 50% anthesis later than cereal rye, so the timing is a little bit different than cereal rye, so we need to adapt for that. And so just some photos of what this looked like. This is 2022 in Aurora, New York. So one of the systems we are plowing down that triticale around elongation in the triticale. And again, we are Also harvesting the triticale as forage around boot stage triticale, early boot for higher quality if you can get in the field. And so for us, it's around mid-May, early May, depending on the weather. And then again, the other growth stage of the triticale is basically at late anthesis is when we're rolling the triticale. And so you can see the soybeans, this is all on the same date. Obviously differences in growth with these different systems. These are just some plants taken on that same day. The difference in the growth stage of the soybeans, and the plow down in this case this year was looking quite well, more vigorous soybean. But then in our no-till systems, the growth wasn't quite as good. Then looking at some yields, so this is 2022 data from Wisconsin. Soybean yield, so we have, again, our 3 treatments. We have rolling, forage, and then the tillage. And you can see kind of the trend in terms of those yields. And then if you look at the gross income, so we have the soybean, but one of the benefits of the double cropping systems, we have added value with that forage triticale. So actually, higher gross income with the triticale forage plus double crop soybean than like the tillage alone. So adding value, getting some value out of that cover crop. One thing we hear a lot from farmers is, if you have this beautiful cover crop, especially if you have livestock, like a lot of organic farmers do in New York and Wisconsin, it's really hard to see that on the ground when there might be additional value, especially monetary value with that crop. So one of the things I want to point out is with the forage harvest, you can see a lot of regrowth of the triticale. And so one of the things that we were interested in across both sites, New York and Wisconsin, is how are we going to manage that regrowth of the triticale? And further, one of the things that makes triticale maybe a little bit more challenging than rye is it doesn't quite terminate as well. So we're also interested in ways of managing that regrowth between triticale and the rolled system. So then because of this interest, we added inter-row mowing as a treatment and see if we could inter-row mow between the 30 inch-row soybeans to manage those weeds. Weeds and really the cover crop regrowth, the triticale regrowth. Oops. And so this is kind of what it looks like after the inter-row mowing. We're mowing in between the triticale. This happened later than ideal. We would have wanted to inter-row mow in those soybeans quite a bit earlier. Sometimes just the way it goes with field work and equipment. And then this is kind of a above head shot of what it looks like as before you're going into stand of soybeans before inter-row mowing. And so same treatments, but now we're adding the rolling plus inter-row mowing, and then the forage plus inter-row mowing. And overall, kind of a general trend is we didn't really see a lot of benefit, at least in this system, of inter-row mowing in the rolled system, but we saw a little bit of benefit of inter-row mowing in the forage system. And this is 2022 New York data. So bushels per acre on the y-axis. But then when we look at the gross income, we didn't have as good of forage, triticale forage yields. And so, while we did have some, added income, overall it was a lower, not as profitable system in New York because we didn't have that triticale growth. So one of the things that we observed in this experiment is, to Ben's point before, is this difference in emergence. And so that's one of the challenges that we really see. Even if we have our planter and everything dialed in, if we have dry conditions, we can see some different emergence in dry conditions, and then basically slower growing soybeans. So this is all photos from on the same date. We have roll crimped, and it's basically the VE stage of soybeans, the forage harvested system, also around VE, and then we have the tilled soil, at this point, unifoliate leaves haven't unrolled, but a little bit bigger growth. So this past year collected some data in terms of, one of the things I've been interested in is looking at the emergent state and the speed of emergence across these different systems. And so again, where this red arrow is, this is when we're planting. So this is this past year, we planted May 12th. So the soybean seed is in the ground. And then this is when we first got emergence. And so the blue line is the forage treatment, the red line is the rolled crimp treatment, and the green line is the till treatment. And one of the interesting things, at least in this year, in this case, the forage actually did a little bit better than the tilled in terms of emergence and reaching max emergence. So this is basically going out every couple days to the same spot and counting the number of plants in a defined row length. And this was the planting population was 250,000 seeds per acre. And we had dry conditions, so we were planting maybe a little bit deeper than you might in wet conditions, so at 2.5 inches. It's to be expected that usually we're losing some seed or not getting the stands. Usually there's a reduction in the stands in these systems. Yeah.
I want to be sure to understand. You talk about the tiller. You tie the rye. No, it's not the rye. It's what's you are.
Triticale?
Triticale. You tie triticale. It's a completely comparison system with everything is fitted, and you don't have triticale.
Yeah. So in the forage system, we are harvesting, flail chopping that forage the day before planting, and then no-till planting into that triticale stubble. So no tillage. So really in this forage system in the roll crimped, it is no-till planting. We're only doing tillage in the tilled system.
It's tillage, and I try to understand why the gap of the gap of yield is that high. In this picture, I try to understand why you have this gap.
Yeah. So one hypothesis is we have lower soil moisture conditions in the rolled crimp system. Basically, it is a bunch of evapotranspiration really drying out the soil where we're not getting as much soybean imbibition to have soybean emergence. The other, so that's one thing. I'm not quite certain why we had faster emergence, higher stand densities in the forage system, at least compared to the tilled. So that kind of surprised me. Really don't have an answer, but it was more of observation and then probably looking closer again this upcoming year about why this difference is occurring.
Your tilled would have lost moisture, wouldn't it?
So in the tilled we are harvesting the triticale. Sorry, not harvesting. We're terminating the triticale quite early, and so. We are, I assume, getting less evapotranspiration, and we do have this data. So we across both sites, we have soil moisture sensors collecting soil moisture through depth and also temperature at depth. Haven't really worked through all of the data yet to fully understand it, but we can answer that question eventually, just not today, unfortunately. And so, in terms of these questions about soybean emergence in this cover crop, inevitably, a lot of it comes down to planter setup. And so, we've been fortunate at both research sites to have good planters with good planter technology. I don't feel it's absolutely necessary. To me, the biggest things are, especially when you're no-till planting, no-till organic planting, is you need to have adequate frame weight. So you're usually adding more weight to your frame. I see a lot of basically planter toolbars are too light. But then you need to have enough down pressure on your row units to really get into the ground. The other thing is we find that planting a little bit deeper than maybe you typically would is helpful. But I feel like, Ben and I have both been very fortunate in terms of having planters with hydraulic downforce, and at least in my experience, that has really helped our system in terms of achieve better success. But then there's other components as well. It's all fairly straightforward in terms of sharp coulters. You need to have a closing system that's good to close that furrow, close that V trench into the mulch. So there's you really need to look at all components, all parts of the system to really make sure it works. And with that, we're going to talk a little bit more about planters, so I'll give it to Ben.
Yeah, so just to go to Chris's point about the importance of having really proper planter setup, I just want to share some historical data that we have from our Wisconsin site here. So what this graph is looking at is it's looking at the amount of rye biomass along the bottom and how that compares to our soybean emergence. And so this is across 31 different no-till soybean experiments that we've done over the past 10 or so years. And we see this relationship between, as we increase that rye biomass, which is what we want to get a lot of biomass so that we're suppressing weeds, we're starting to see this decline in soybean emergence. And so we've done some work trying to figure out how we can really set up our planters to make this successful for us and to start to not see as much of a relationship between emergence and rye biomass. And so we've worked with a really fabulous collaborator from Biosystems Engineering, Dr. Brian Luck, who put together this planter for us, which has a lot of really great technology built into it. And we did an experiment over the past several years where we saw that if we use hydraulic downforce up to 300 pounds per row unit, we can see improvements in our soybean emergence. And if we use a coulter, we can see improvements in our soybean emergence. And really that becomes more pronounced as we go into drier soil conditions. So we wanted to kind of take that to the next level this year and ask, well, even if we use a coulter, what kind of coulter is the best coulter to go into this kind of system? And just some examples of what we're worried about. So this picture here, we're not seeing that rye getting cut, and we can see soybean seeds here just kind of sitting on top of the soil surface. And what happens is that leads to really low and inconsistent plant stands like we see in that picture over there. What we're looking for more on the other side is something like this, where we're getting really clean cutting of that rye residues, and the seed placement in that picture there is really, really ideal. You can see how those are just nestled into the furrow, and we're really likely to see good emergence out of a situation like that. And you can see kind of the results of what that looks like. So the experiment we set up is we wanted to prepare kind of a gradient of different how sharp-edged our coulters were. So on one end, we got a straight coulter, and then on the other end, we have an 8-wave coulter. So going from very straight to pretty wavy in how those coulters are built. And so a couple things we measured. So first of all, we wanted to look at how many soybean seeds are just sitting on the surface of the soil or caught in the rye mulch. So this is stuff that's not getting into the furrow, so not likely to have good emergence out of those soybean seeds. And then we measured what our emergences were in our plant stands. And I'll say all of this first with a caveat of we planted into extremely, extremely dry soil conditions this year. It was kind of like going into concrete. We bumped up our downforce to 500 pounds, and even that was not enough in some cases. And it's evidenced here by the fact that even in the best of cases, we're still seeing about a quarter to a third of all the seeds we planted just on the soil surface and not in the furrow. So conditions that we were planting into this year were really far from ideal. But we still did see some interesting trends out of this data. So we saw that with that 8-wave coulter, we really weren't getting the seeds in the ground very effectively. And with some of these other ones, we were doing a much better job of getting those seeds into the ground. In terms of emergence and soybean stand, we did see a trend for the straighter edge coulter to have better soybean stands. And as we got more and more wavy on our coulter, those stands started to decrease. So interesting trends. We're excited to try to do this again next year and see across a range of different soil conditions, because the ideal planter setup can vary based on your soil environment and what the conditions are that you're planting into. So we want to get this data across a few years. Was there a question here? Yep. We were shooting 225,000. So yeah, again, this is 50%-ish or less of emergence this year.
Is that a double disc opener on your plant?
Yeah, double disc opener, yep. Yep.
You talk about what the difference between tillage or no-till, that then you will be able to establish will be the path. It's hard to have the same result at the end. So that could be a big, not just a water problem. That could be an established land problem. The seed is not there, not at the right place.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a problem of water.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. So the point being made here is that some of the differences in yield, it can be soil moisture related, but also what our plant populations are. And typically when we think about the relationship between plant populations and yield, when we have low plant populations and as we start to increase that, we see a pretty strong trend towards improving yields. And eventually that kind of levels off somewhere. But what we've learned from some of the work Cornell University has done is that having those high populations can also be really important for suppressing weeds too. And so in organic systems, getting those high populations are really important for yields. And also just from a cost effectiveness, if we're getting really low emergence here, somewhere around 50%, we're essentially wasting 50% of our seeds. And so trying to close that gap a little bit more and improve our emergence. A couple other interesting points we saw from this experiment. So this is looking at weed biomass here on the left-hand side. And we've heard anecdotally that with more wavy coulters, it can kind of do a little bit of tillage almost within the furrow and just open up more space for weeds to come through. And we did see some of that this year actually in this experiment. So our weed pressure was quite low throughout, but in that 8-wave coulter, we did see statistically more weeds coming through than when we had this straight coulter. But at the end of the day, we didn't see any differences in grain yield by coulter type this year. And again, excited to try to do this next year and see if we see some more trends related to that. All right, so we're gonna kind of switch gears now and talk about some of the work we've been doing with no-till or reduced-till corn. Maybe I'll just open it up for any questions, if there's any questions related to some of the soybean work we're doing before we switch gears. Yep, go ahead.
I had a question about use both triticale and rye cover crop.
Yep.
Do you lose some of the allopathic effect with triticale versus rye, or are they about the same?
Yeah, so the question is if triticale and rye have equivalent allelopathic effects, or if one of them is better than the other. And what I've always heard is that rye is more allelopathic than triticale. I believe triticale has some allelopathic effects as well, but not as strong as rye. Does that sound right to you, Chris? Yeah? I think so. Okay. Question in the back there?
How much biomass needs to be left to maintain that allelopathic effect, considering using it as a forage crop as well?
Yeah, so question about how much biomass that we need in order to see that allelopathic effect. And I'll let Chris fill in the gaps on this, but the way that I've kind of thought about this is we see really strong allelopathic effects from these cereal grains when they're young. And so at that point when it's tillering is when we're really getting good weed suppression from allelopathy. Once we kill them off, it's maybe less of an allelopathic effect and more of a nitrogen effect that we're seeing that's suppressing the weeds. Chris, do you have anything more to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, the question of allelopathy in cereal rye is kind of contentious. Some people, it's hard to measure, so it's hard to quantify, like, is it nitrogen mobilization? Is it resource competition from that vigorously growing cereal rye? Also that amount of mulch from that cereal rye. So some of the research, at least in terms of the amount of biomass, suggests around 8,000 pounds per acre is kind of the minimum that you need to get great weed suppression. A lot of that work has been done in the Mid-Atlantic. At least for us in New York, we can have pretty good success actually getting away with less biomass. We always want more, but if we're around 5,000 to 6,000, that's kind of our cutoff where, the system can perform well. So that's kind of the ballpark that we're reaching. But yeah, I think there's still lots of questions in terms of the effect of allelopathy versus just competition from that zero rye.
Yep, right back there.
So with the crimp system and the weeds, right? Obviously, that biomass is supposed to suppress. So what about the forage system? Like I don't know if I heard much about what the weed situation was like after you took off that forage with the triticale.
Yeah, so we didn't share any graphs on that. What we saw in Wisconsin, I think what we saw was kind of different in Wisconsin and New York. In Wisconsin, we saw that the weeds really came through strongly in that forage system once we removed that mulch. And interesting, though, to see that the profitability of that system was still higher even with the weeds because of that added value that we were getting from the triticale forage harvest. But I'll let Chris talk about what they saw in Wisconsin. I think it was different.
Yeah, I mean, so far we've done 4 site years of this. We're going to be doing 2 more site years, both New York and Wisconsin this upcoming year. Every year is a little bit different. I think a lot of it depends on basically the perennial weeds that are established after you harvest that triticale forage, and also just the weed seed bank of what annuals are there as well. At least in 2022 in New York, we actually did. It was a lower weed seed bank field, and we did get regrowth of that triticale, which it's hard to say exactly, but I wonder if that kind of helped with some of the weed suppression. Klaus actually in the room, he's had lots of experience as well, forage harvesting the triticale and then no-till planting and having some success too. But yeah, the weeds are definitely a concern, but also the regrowth of the triticale is a potential problem in terms of competition with the soybean as well.
Question right there?
Yeah, you talked about kind of the planter setup of different no-till cultures. Any setup options with like a row cleaner, just with the straight culture?
So we haven't really tried that, so I can't speak so much from experience. Kind of what I've heard, though, is with the row cleaner, you do risk opening up more space for weeds to come through in the furrow because it is moving that residue out of the way. But at least it would make sense that you could potentially get better emergence if you're moving that out of the way before you're putting the seed in the ground. Yep.
To go along with his question, have you ever tried the prescription tillage STP saber-tooth opener blade?
I have not. Yeah, so this is a serrated blade.
Serrated blade.
And the one thing I do know about it is, yeah, it does a pretty good job cutting, but it does have a higher downforce requirement to get that double disc, in the soil.
But it will
something I would like to try and experiment with.
It will cut.
Plus,
Did either of you count how many weeds were emerged when the forage was harvested? What I noticed was we had almost no new weed emergence where we removed the forage, except for the weeds that were already emerging at the time we cut them.
we do have that data. I don't remember exactly, but we do have that data, Klaus.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll be, as we look through these results and interpret them, that'll be something we'll be looking at closely as well.
That could be important for adaptive management, where you take counts and
Yes.
what species are there at the time you take your forage harvest.
Yep, yeah, counts in terms of what's there, but also, what species are there, and are they going to be a problem with, competitive with the soybean?
We'll do maybe one more question, then hopefully we'll have some more time at the end. But I saw one in the back, orange, over there.
I was just making a comment.
Okay.
We've been running the PTI blades. There's no till over in front of it into between 2 and 3 bushels of cereal level, and we really like them. I think it does a nice job of cutting. We haven't had no till holders on our planter in a long time, but those PTIs, they do take a little bit more downforce, but I don't think it's undoable. Even on somebody that's spring or something like that.
Yeah. All right, so we'll switch gears here a little bit to some of our work with no-till corn. This has been something that we've been interested in at Cornell and University of Wisconsin for a number of years now. And in our soybean systems, we've seen pretty good consistency with our success. Again, in the dry years, there's a little bit more variability, but largely speaking, it's been a system that's worked pretty well for us. The corn system has been a lot more of a challenge for a number of reasons. But we've been working on trying to address some of those challenges and figuring out systems that can reduce the amount of variability we're seeing from year to year and hopefully eventually closing some of those yield gaps that we're seeing between our cultivated systems and the reduced tillage systems. So kind of what we've been looking at is two main different strategies. So on one hand, we have this rye vetch system that where roller crimp works quite a bit like the soybean system we had. And I'm going to let Chris talk about that a little bit more later and some of the interesting things that they're seeing out at Cornell. Past couple of years here at Wisconsin, we've been working on this clover system. So essentially this is a living mulch system where we have clover growing between the rows of corn, and we never terminate it throughout the growing season. It's growing there together with the corn. And I'll discuss some of the results we've seen from that. Just in terms of kind of some of the benefits and disadvantages to each of these systems. So with this rye vetch system, we see really strong weed suppressive abilities. Again, it's putting on a lot of biomass, and then we terminate it. So whereas the clover systems may be adding some competition with the corn, typically, unless we don't get good termination with the vetch and the rye, we're not getting competition as much from the cover crops. The vetch can supply a lot of nitrogen, and in some years, especially at Cornell, they've seen some pretty high yield potentials with this system. So it certainly has promise, but there are some risks to it. First of all, you have late planting dates because we're reliant on that, especially the hairy vetch, for when it can get to a growth stage where we can successfully kill it, and that can push our planting dates of corn into June and a bit later than we'd typically like to go. Where we mix rye with the hairy vetch to add a little bit more biomass, we've seen some issues here in Wisconsin with armyworms that feed on the rye and then move into the corn once we terminate it. Also, a lot of concern about the vetch coming back in multiple years, or in subsequent years in that field and kind of acting as a weed. And also there's kind of this open question about, even though the vetch is supplying a lot of nitrogen, is that nitrogen actually coming at a point when the corn is needing it? And so there's some questions about, I guess, the mineralization of that nitrogen and how well the corn is able to utilize it. This clover system, the benefits are often in response to some of these risks that we see out of the rye vetch system. So for example, planting date, we're not trying to terminate it with a roller crimper, so we're not as dependent on having a late planting date. We can go in at the end of May, maybe when we would typically be planting cultivated corn, and get some more growing degree days out of it. We don't see the concerns with armyworm because we're not having a grass cover crop ahead of it. Don't see the issues with the hard seededness as much, and also we have that opportunity to use that clover cover crop as a forage crop as well to add a little bit additional value. But the risk here is we can see quite a bit of competition from that clover cover crop as it's growing alongside the corn. And the clover is not really providing a lot of nitrogen until you actually terminate it, and so some questions about fertility. In our trials, we've seen a little bit lower yield potential here, and then where we do strip tillage, it can be a challenge to control the weeds within the row, and so we're still figuring out good strategies to address that. But just some data that we've seen. So over the past 3 years, I pulled some of the best treatments that we had across these 3 years and then compared it to what we would typically expect for cultivated corn yield in our area. So assuming around 180 bushels per acre for that cultivated corn, and then you can kind of see the yield gaps depending on years. And it's performed relatively well in some years, and kind of what we're seeing is important is how well we're able to manage that clover cover crop throughout the season. And so this graph here on the right is showing our corn yield in comparison to the clover biomass that we're seeing within the corn row. And essentially what it's showing is where we did undercutting, which is kind of a form of strip tilling, we were able to get pretty good yield potential, but where we didn't do that, we see that relationship with yield really become more of an issue. In 2022, we had some issues just environmentally and with some of the equipment where we weren't able to get good strip tillage control, and so really low yield potentials overall. So we know that managing clover competition is important in the system for success, and so the questions we were really asking is how can we go about doing this effectively and trying to increase our yield potential in the system. And so going back to that inter-row mower that we've been excited about here at Cornell and the University of Wisconsin, we set up an experiment where we kind of created a gradient in management intensity. So on one extreme we did tillage, so we didn't have any living mulch cover crop there. And then also a pretty management-intensive system. We used a forage harvest at the beginning of the season to cut back all of that clover biomass right before planting. And then we went in with that inter-row mower a couple times throughout the growing season at the V2 and the V4 growth stage and further controlled that clover regrowth. Then we did a treatment where we didn't do the forage harvest, but we just did some inter-row mowing throughout the year at those 2 different times. And then a treatment where we did the forage harvest at the beginning of the season, but we didn't do any inter-row mowing afterwards. And then one where kind of on the other extreme where we just didn't manage it at all. We did strip tillage to it like all of the other treatments, but we didn't do any kind of inter-row mowing or forage harvest of that one. So general system management for that is we applied manure, planted that clover in the fall at about 15 pounds per acre. And then what's in red here, that's what was different by our experimental treatment. So the forage harvesting happened in a few plots right before we established the corn. We did strip tillage and everything, and then planted 80-day maturity corn, 38,000 seeds per acre. Applied some fertility around planting time as well. And then in those few treatments that have the inter-row mower, we did some inter-row mowing at two growth stages of the corn, the V2 and the V4. So a couple things we saw, so just measuring the clover biomass. We measured it at 3 different points in the growing season. And so at the first point, this June 30, we see that we reduced that clover biomass in any of the treatments that had the forage harvest, which makes sense because we removed that. But that forage harvest treatment, the biomass regrew pretty quickly and was equivalent to where we didn't do any kind of management by July 18th. And it was really the inter-row mowing that was able to successfully keep that clover biomass lower throughout the growing season. And so this is just kind of what that looked like out in the field. So on the left-hand side, you can see pretty tall clover. That's where we didn't do any management. And then the one in the middle, we had just done a passive inter-row mowing, so that's that biomass is quite a bit shorter. And then the tillage corn is on the other side there. And so we wanted to see what effects this had on the corn throughout the growing season. So we did some measurements of plant health and vigor. And so one measurement we did was SPAD readings, which is essentially a proxy measurement for nitrogen in the corn. It's measuring the chlorophyll. And we see some trends for as we increase that intensity of management, we were able to see a bit higher SPAD readings, so essentially healthier plants. And in terms of growth stages, really the tilled one was far and away the most advanced in terms of growth stages, but we did see some slight, very subtle trends towards, again, increasing that intensity of management, seeing that corn be a little bit more advanced. Our yields were not statistically different, but again, we saw where we did that inter-row mowing, it was, at least numerically, we saw trends for having that be a little bit higher than where we did just a forage harvest or no management at all. Now the yields this year were relatively low, and I think a lot of that just goes to the drought that we had. We were very, very much impacted by that, especially in this system. It's a more water-intensive system because we have that clover growing alongside as well. And so we were seeing, leaf curling in our living mulch plots pretty severely, and less so in our tilled ones. And this here is just a picture of a corn seedling that was really digging deep for soil moisture before it was really able to put on any above ground growth. So a few key lessons that we learned. First of all, strip tillage is really critical in this system, and the ability to control that clover biomass within during the growing season is important. And where we're able to control that biomass effectively throughout the season, we saw a bit of improvements in plant health and vigor. And inter-row mowing was really a tool that was successful for us in that system. So I'm going to turn this over to Chris now, and he'll just talk a little bit more about the rye vetch systems.
Yeah, so we're going to be moving to straight organic no-till corn. And so, at least in New York, in our lab, we did not have lots of success early on with organic no-till, and we just kind of paused it. And then we revisited it a couple years ago, and we've had some success, which has given us some optimism to keep working, to keep learning. And first I'm going to start off with different components of the system. So at least in my opinion, cover crop-based organic no-till, really the foundation, your workhorse is your cover crop. And so this is an experiment where we had basically 5 different treatments, 4 different cover crops, so winter canola, cereal rye, hairy vetch, and then a hairy vetch and cereal rye mix, and then we had a no cover crop tilled control. And so in this case, so this is data from 2021 and 2022, we're planting these cover crops all at the same date, basically early September is our cutoff. And as you might expect, if we look at the cover crop biomass and the weeds that following spring, right before we want to plant, in the tilled system, no cover crop to suppress the weeds. Those are the orange dots over here. We're getting biomass, but we can get pretty good weed suppression with those different cover crops. One of the things I guess I'll draw your eyes to is, in this hairy vetch monoculture, we're not getting as good a weed suppression, but we are getting, lots of biomass and lots of cover crop biomass and great weed suppression, as in winter canola and also the cereal rye and the hairy vetch and cereal rye mix. When we look at the emerged stands from those cover crops, this was planted at roughly 41,000 seeds per acre. So higher seeding rates are typically used. And 2022 was a drier year, so a theme that's reoccurring. Dry years, we get lower emergence, some compromised stands. But overall, this, we're across the different cover crop treatments, we're getting decent emergence where we should be okay. And even, in this case, equivalent to the no cover crop tilled control. And so one of the things, though, is they're not always even emergence. So you can kind of see, there's, some corn in this case that is a little bit more advanced than other ones. So that's one of the challenges as well in this system. But cover crop selection is important. So even though we can get good weed suppression, we get good stands in winter canola, for example, winter canola is not great in terms of it providing long-lasting mulch that suppresses weeds throughout the year in organic no-till. Similarly, cereal rye, great weed suppression, but there's lots of nitrogen mobilization. So this is bushels per acre. And then this is a dry year for us in 2022 where, even though we were not getting lots of cover crop biomass in the hairy vetch monoculture, we're still getting respectable yields. Draw your eye to the hairy vetch and cereal rye mix. In this case, it was yielding less than the hairy vetch. I suspect due to nitrogen mobilization as well. And then this is the no cover crop till control to give you an idea of tilled versus no-till comparison in this case. The previous year looked at the effect of starter fertilizer versus no starter fertilizer. The idea being, if we are getting nitrogen mobilization, can we reduce some of that nitrogen immobilization by applying a starter fertilizer? So in this case, it's basically 25 pounds of N per acre applied, dry fertilizer. This is a poultry litter and feather meal mix that's going out in the planter. And at least in this year, we didn't really see much of a, we saw some benefit in some cases, but it did suggest, at least in the hairy vetch, we can get all of the nitrogen we probably need in the system. And this was a year where it worked really well for us. So it was a little bit wetter year. And we could get, we got 200 bushels per acre in the hairy vetch monoculture. And again, the winter canola, cereal rye, not too surprising, but not great yields. Not good cover crop candidates for organic no-till corn. And the other thing is, a lot of the research has been hairy vetch and cereal rye. Our experience in New York is hairy vetch and cereal rye mixes have not done so well for us. So we've been moving more towards hairy vetch monocultures and also hairy vetch with companion crops, winter killing companion crops like oats. And so this is kind of the mental model that we've been thinking about in terms of like, how can we optimize the system? How can we keep working towards improvement? So, if we're interested in, increasing this corn yield, we believe nitrogen is a big factor. But if we have more nitrogen, likely we're going to get more weeds. But also we hope to get more corn. So we need to manage those weeds. So one way of managing those weeds, in an organic no-till system, is, can the inter-row mower play a role in this? The other thing, from both Ben and I talking, the importance of crop density in these systems. And so, if we have low crop density, we're probably going to get some weed suppression. We're going to get some more weeds. And so in many cases, in soybean and in corn, we find that if we can get good emerged stands, we can get added weed suppression from those stands. So if we have, higher crop density, hope to, decrease the amount of weeds, and then hopefully that will also contribute to corn yield. So this is kind of the way we're thinking, and this is how we kind of thought of designing this experiment. So this experiment was this past year, and this was 2 cover crop types, so hairy vetch plus oats, hairy vetch plus cereal rye, 4 seeding rates, 15,000, 30,000, 45,000, 60,000 seeds per acre, then 4 nitrogen rates, and then weed management, basically none, and inter-row mowing. And so, I realize that this is, especially some of these seeding rates and nitrogen rates, these aren't really for recommendations. This is for us to understand what is the potential of the system and what are the little levers, what are the little knobs we can turn to improve this system. And so this is the whole basis of why we did this experiment. Yes? So that's the other thing. So in this case, it was Chilean. So, this proof of concept research, your certifier would never let you do this, but, again, we're adding this nitrogen to understand, if nitrogen is not limiting, what can we expect in this system? And so I'm just going to pull a subset of the data, but across all those treatments, so in this case, we had 2 sites in this past year, so a total of 512 experimental plots that we're collecting this data from. So when we look across all seeding rate and nitrogen rate combinations, we get a 30% increase when using hairy vetch plus oats versus hairy vetch plus cereal rye. So kind of supporting previous research experience that we've had where it seems like we're getting some yield drag with hairy vetch and cereal rye. And then across all seeding rate and nitrogen rate combinations, we're getting a 20% increase in yield when we're inter-row mowing versus not inter-row mowing. And so these increases are in yield. And so I'm gonna, this next figure, so a lot going on here. So this is just looking at a subset of the data, organic no-till corn with hairy vetch plus oat cover crop and inter-row mowing. And so on the y-axis, we have the bushels per acre, the corn grain yield, and then on the x-axis, we have the nitrogen rate, and then these different dots are the different seeding rates. And so, we're still exploring this data, trying to understand it more. One of them maybe disappointing or maybe surprising things was that we weren't getting as much nitrogen in this system than previous years. I think a lot of it is weather related. We kind of got lucky in 2022 and 2021 in terms of good organic corn, no-till corn yields. But this past year, we had first it was really dry, and then it became really wet. We had smoke, we didn't have lots of solar radiation, so I think there's lots of environmental factors at play too. So we weren't able, these, where we are applying no nitrogen, this is really the nitrogen we're getting from the soil organic matter and also from that cover crop. And so that was one thing that's surprising. But, this is kind of, if we applied nitrogen, really around 150 pounds per acre, that was where we're getting some of our higher yields, in this case around 100 bushels per acre. And then, we have these seeding rates as well. And, need to dig into this data more, but, this is just a start, and we'll be continuing some more of this work. So moving on, maybe a problem for me and for others in our lab, but usually there's these little parts of fields where nothing is really planned, and I find an opportunity to put something in because I have these questions. So this was a seeding rate by corn relative maturity date experiment. And so I saw this, part of a field that I had planted. So this is a photo on April 20th. Great stand of hairy vetch. So on the right, great, at that point, great ground cover. And so I was really curious in, playing with longer season corn relative maturity varieties, but also planting dates and understanding, can we get extra yield? And so these are the different cover crop termination dates and corn planting dates. So we're planting and rolling and crimping and planting corn the same day. And so this photo is taken June 9th. So I had just planted and this treatment here, basically full bloom, and then planted May 31st, May 19th, and then this is June 20th. So at this point, in the June 20th, I haven't yet planted, it's still growing. Photo from June 23rd, just kind of looking.
No, we have about 3 minutes left.
Okay, yeah. And looking at the amount of ground cover, and this is basically the emerged stand. And so this is planted on June 9th in this picture. It rained basically 3 inches immediately after planting. And so, this is 14 days after planting, and the corn is roughly at V2. Another photo of some, pretty good organic no-till corn. A photo just before harvest of some of the ears in one of the plots. And this is just, so this is the bushels per acre. So we have the 4 planting dates, and then we have the 4 corn relative maturities. So 75, 85, 95, 105 day corn. And keep in mind, these are just raw averages. There's, there's no, statistically, there's nothing you can take away from this, but just to show, what we could achieve. And so basically we're finding, at least in this one year, this past year, this is where we had kind of the sweet spot of yield. And at least for our area, the 85 to 95 day corn, but we can't go, we can go a little bit earlier, but there may not be great yield benefit. And so this is something that I'm kind of interested in terms of pushing the system, understanding more. This is a figure of that same experiment. These are all the plots that were harvested. So corn grain yield, bushels per acre on the y-axis. So some plots, individual plots, had 200 up to 250 bushels per acre. And on the x-axis, this is the plants per acre. And really, the point here is still we need those stands to achieve the yields. And so in this case, we had a really dry, basically May up to June 9th. And some of the plots just had really poor emergence. So it's continuing to be a factor that we need to improve. So that's some of the organic no-till corn work that we've done. Lots of people are part of this research. I'm probably missing people, but obviously, big thanks to Matt Ryan, Aaron Silva. We have our farmer advisors. This is the Ryan Lab team at Cornell, and previous graduate students. A lot of people doing this work. Couldn't do it alone. And also, obviously, a lot of thanks to all the UW-Madison crew as well for this work. That's it.
Right at 10:30, but there's a break after this, so I think maybe we could just take a few questions and.
Feel free to leave and go mingle, but we can also stick around here a bit and have a discussion and have some clarifying questions as well. So if you don't feel like you need to stick around, we're happy to stick around here.
Yeah.
I know winter peas have an issue with survivability sometimes with disposable dead when it needs in this system. And, removing hairy vetch and using winter peas.
Yeah, my personal experience, at least in upstate New York, is we've had some issues with winter pea survival and some root rot. Kloss has much better success with winter peas in upstate New York. My only, I don't know this for sure, but my guess is that we probably can't get the amount of biomass as early as hairy vetch. One of the things as well is, really September 1st, at least for us in upstate New York, is kind of the cutoff, I would say, for planting hairy vetch for maximum biomass production. Ideally, you want to do it in late August. In some of these systems, some of the experiments I was showing, we were planting a little bit later, so I feel like there's still potential in terms of improvement. Getting, producing that nitrogen, on the land, also that weed suppression from earlier planting. Yeah, I don't know if we can get that with the current pea varieties available right now.
I tried winter pea. The first 2 years I was doing this, like 2007, 2008, back when we had more, I think, normal winters in Wisconsin and good consistent snow cover. I was convinced that was the way to go for roller crimping because it did put on a decent amount of biomass, and it has a relatively high seeded ratio for a legume, so the biomass stuck around, and we reached that kind of early pod set earlier. So whereas in Wisconsin, vetch doesn't really reach that stage until about June 20th, we can get more consistent kill. But I thought winter pea had hit that stage more around Memorial Day and had more of a condensed maturity period. And one of the issues with terminating vetch is that it just has this kind of extended flowering period, kind of indeterminate flowering period, and it's challenging to terminate. But I just have not, everything class has told me to do in terms of trying to get those peas to overwinter, planting them deep, planting with a nurse crop. There's just too many freeze thaw events now, I think. This year would have been interesting to see, but it's like we don't have that consistent snow cover and that this freeze thaw, melting, ground freezing, I just can't get it to work.
Yeah.
Might be just 1 or 2 degrees difference in average temperature.
I think we're right on the border, which is why some of you folks that are in Illinois, Indiana, I'd be curious if maybe working together just to see if you guys wanted to fool around with some, to see how it might work. But I think but then again, it's still a free spot too. I don't know.
And there is some work with,
Shoulder high,
Yeah.
and the biggest problem we had was there was so much nitrogen, they broke down, and we got late weeds because they broke down fast, too fast.
That's interesting. Yeah, 'cause I think that's the issue with some of these legumes too, is they break down too quickly. So you can have a higher T-N ratio in some of these legumes, the residue will persist longer. That's definitely a risk of us, which is why we're adding rye in there too, which definitely is all these trade-offs. It's going to potentially immobilize nitrogen more, but you get that residue more.
My research question there would be, how was your windbreak situation?
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
The windbreak can make a huge difference.
Yeah, with just that desiccation over the field.
In your clear trial, instead of using the biannual red clover, have you considered using an annual like crimson or a Balanza? Is something that's going to die out?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Asking about if we've tried some other different clover types, especially ones that are not the biennial ones and the ones that could die out. And the issue that we've run into is, so we're planting this clover in the fall, and we're hoping that that clover will overwinter. And so in our environment, crimson clover, balanza, we're not going to see overwintering of those. If we plant it in the spring, I guess I haven't tried, I don't know if Aaron has, but my guess is we probably wouldn't get enough biomass out of that early to suppress weeds.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Leia is in there, but Leia did some of that work, and it just didn't get enough biomass soon enough that the corn would just be delayed. Now, crimson sometimes will overwinter here, sometimes not. Balanza definitely not.
When she spring seeded the land to clover, when did she terminate?
Well, it has to be terminated, I can't remember exactly when, but you have to wait till, with any of the roller crimping, for anything flowering, it needs to be a full flower or the seed pod stage, which I don't think happens until later in June.
Okay, so she spring seeded the land to clover and roll crimp.
I think so, I don't want to say what way it is, but yeah, we just won't overwinter.
one species that we're kind of interested in that we tried this past year in an experiment was yellow blossom sweet clover. And so, its mileage may vary in terms of how people perceive it as a noxious weed. But for us, we were able to establish it in some organic winter wheat. And then it's a true biennial. So we actually rolled and crimped it. In this case, it was early June this past year, and basically had great kill of the yellow blossom sweet clover at full bloom. Not really a living mulch because we weren't, we had some regrowth, but we had pretty good kill of that cover crop, that clover. Yeah, right here.
Are you using a flame or anything in your experimenting, your research?
Are we using a flamer in any of our research? In the Ryan lab, we are not, but I'll let Ben answer the rest.
Yeah, so we tried using a flamer actually in our living mulch systems, and it didn't, from my experience, it didn't do a lot. We saw a little bit of reduction in weed biomass, but it didn't do anything towards terminating the clover or anything.
Okay, so you tried it
In clover, yeah. I don't have personal experience using it in a cultivated or tillage type system, but.
So, at what time did you what was the time frame when you ran the flamer? And did you just run it over the row?
Yeah, so we just ran it over the row. We did it right at planting, so I mean the clover was big at this point. And yeah, we wanted to keep the biomass there early just to suppress weeds and to add any potential nitrogen of it. But yeah, the clover was big at that point.
John.
Sure. And you use management coloring on the medium red? I know it's often used as single cut where we use a cutter because it's less likely to regrow there, so we use that.
So the question is, have we used mammoth red clover as opposed to like a typical medium red? We have not done that, but something I've thought about, especially if we are interested in the forage component of the system, looking more at.
I use mammoth already, and I don't see it right, it's a little woody in the red gold. I didn't think the corn would be, without them tilling. What kind of strip till do you use? What type, was it extremely aggressive?
So I think we learned a lot about strip tilling this year, and we're going to do some things different next year. But we used, it was like a disc blade one. In the past, we've used more of a shank blade that just kind of cuts underneath and cuts off the roots. The issue we had with the shank blade one is in wet conditions that clover kind of replants itself if it's not actually getting mixed in. I think we did strip tillage too late this year because we waited till close to planting, and that clover is pretty big, and so more the disc blade one wasn't able to really effectively mix it in and terminate it well. So we had to do a couple passes with it to get a decent enough strips developed. I think what we'll try next year is going early with the strip tiller and doing that maybe at the beginning of May or late April, and then doing kind of a cleanup pass right before planting.
I used blue jet 5 years ago, trying to strip till over, it was that.
Mm-hmm.
Total that. Then last fall, I got a little guy trying to develop the strip till again. Like I would use this blade type, no change, press of this blade. He said guaranteed to work. I was blowing him on last fall. I tried to use strip. So I did cut it for a small rigger, try to strip and get, so you can get some of that decomposed, but those two on the spring. I did get some strips today last fall.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
That was brought up at some point in the past couple of days was that the strip till equipment that has been designed for conventional agriculture, the residue that is been designed to be able to handle it is not appropriate for these applications. So I
Most of them don't kill weeds. It makes first dirt, but it don't get rid of the weeds.
Yeah.
Can you touch on your management prior to planting the hairy vetch?
So the question was management before planting hairy vetch. So are you curious about like?
As far as what led up to it, because you said the hairy vetch planted late August.
Yeah, I mean, so it's an important point. So we are basically doing tillage before establishing the hairy vetch. In many cases, tillage before establishing these cover crops as we start down this path of organic no-till. And so we want to clean up, perennial weeds. We want to really have, set up ourselves for success. In terms of management, late August to early September is like ideal in this system. We're using higher seeding rates, so 30 pounds per acre of hairy vetch seed. Really, we're at the point in the research where, if we feel like there's some opportunity and things are working, then we can start working on optimization in terms of like maybe we can get away with less seed. And then basically using a no-till drill, 7.5 inch spacing to establish that hairy vetch. What we've kind of liked is what we've moved towards is also applying around 30 pounds to 40 pounds of winter-killing oats with their hairy vetch as a companion crop. We see some weed suppression benefits, also some snow catch, and also I feel like some temperature buffering where it helps that hairy vetch. This is actually one photo. This is December. We didn't get a lot of oat growth, but there's hairy vetch in there, and we really like having the oat companion crop if we're going kind of more for a straight hairy vetch. Yeah.
In the roller crimp rye planting soybeans into it, if you had access to a no-till drill at 7.5 inch space, would you do that versus 30-inch rows? You got any data on a row width for soybeans in the roller crimp rye?
So the question is, if you don't have access to a no-till planter with 30-inch row spacing, would a grain drill or a no-till drill 7.5 inch spacing work? I don't have as much experience with it. If you have the right no-till planter, I think it can work well, but I think it's when you're using that row spacing and that type of planting system, I feel like it's maybe even more critical that you have good soil moisture to plant in. There's a PFI. PFI put out some data where they asked that question, and they had actually, some farmers had good experience with drilling compared to the 30-inch row spacing. I've done it 1 year, and we had pretty good yields, but haven't really looked at it further in terms of if you can get away with the drill compared to a no-till planter.
We found that the pounds of weight per row is much better at 15 inches than 7.5 because we got twice as much weight available for down pressure.
Yep, and so that's the trade-off. You need a heavy planter, and if you're going to have whatever I think of more steel, more ground contact, then you need more weight, you need more down pressure in your row unit. So yeah.
That's what we've found too in Wisconsin. I mean, we've done many years of trials. There wasn't necessarily, and like Chris was saying, depending on soil moisture, sometimes we're able to get the seed in the ground better, and a lot of it comes to getting the seed into the ground, which is where the weight and down pressure and optimizing planters makes that impact. But it doesn't give us a yield advantage. We were thinking maybe it'd be better because we have a better canopy closure, quicker canopy closure. If you are doing it, I might recommend planting into standing rye at anthesis if you are willing to do a two-pass operation, because trying to get crimping first and using a drill on 7.5 inch rows through the rye is problematic. And sometimes if you don't have a plan to optimize, it's actually easier to run over the field one standing rye because you're not cutting through that mulch and then going over and crimping. Not early, and not like some of you see the videos and the research was done on planting at the boot stage. Not that, but just literally the same day, trying to optimize and really run some soil moisture events or precipitation, planting your standing rye
planting before you're ready.
In our organic no-till drilling experience, so we're using a 1590 no-till drill, John Deere, and yeah, we can really apply a lot of downforce with that drill, but you really need to have ballast on the back end to make sure that drive wheel is down. And yeah, I've seen that back drive wheel up in the air, and yeah, you're going to have issues with metering seed.
Tractor wheel way on the back wheel itself, I think.
Yeah.
You decide your cover is broadcast or seeding?
So we typically seed it with a drill just to get.
And why do you evaluate use alfalfa?
Yeah, so we did do this in alfalfa system as well this year, and it did not perform well at all. So I did not present that data. I think just based on how dry it was this year, the alfalfa had really deep taproots established and took up a lot more soil moisture, so the field conditions are really dry. The advantage, I think, to alfalfa, and we're going to do this again next year, and hopefully we'll have some different conditions to evaluate it, but the red clover can be kind of a viney crop and kind of go into the corn rows, whereas alfalfa is a lot more upright, and so I think there's some advantages to it. This year was not a good year for us to have success in that system, but again, we'll try to next year and hope for different results.